the formation of a new government and the relevant considerations, and put three matters to you. This is the relevant considerations in the formation of government. First, various forms of voting, for example, primary votes and two-party preferred votes, which we've heard so much about on both sides. Second, the Senate numbers, and I noticed that Paul Kelly referred to this, and he couldn't resist saying the Senate numbers are irrelevant, despite Sir Garfield Barwick's wrong opinion. And I thought that was really another question rather than on confidence. And the third matter is the question of stability. How relevant for the Governor-General or Governor should be this question of the stability of the government?
Okay. Well, the first two are easy in that they're completely irrelevant. So it doesn't matter at all what proportion of the popular vote you got, whether it's two-party preferred or whether it's how many primary votes you got. All the commentators in England, Canada, Australia, and I've looked at it, united in saying that's just completely irrelevant. Right? The consideration in terms of the formation of government is how much support you have on the floor of the lower house. That's what counts. So if you've got a party that controls a certain number of seats, or if you've got independents and small parties that are prepared to give you support, the question is, do you have the confidence of the lower house? And if nobody has the confidence of the lower house, well, who is the most likely to be able to obtain the confidence of the lower house? They're the questions that are asked. It matters not one iota who got the most votes in terms of primary vote, popular vote, all the rest of it. Equally, if you couldn't form government unless you also had the support of the upper house, well, we wouldn't have had too many governments for a very long time. Clearly, you don't need the support of the upper house. I mean, New South Wales, we haven't had government support in the upper house since they changed the voting system at the time of Neville Wran, I think. So that's again also a fair fear. I mean, presumably the Barwick reference was to the other issue of can you continue in government if you don't have supply, and that's a further issue. So both whether you have control of the Senate or not, irrelevant to forming government in the lower house, and what proportion of the vote you got, also irrelevant. The third issue about stability in government. Now that's a really tricky one, and that was the one that I was primarily trying to write about to explain the nuances in this to potentially the players. So why this is tricky is that there are circumstances in which stability is a very important thing, but they are normally circumstances where you already have a government and it has lost a vote on the floor of the House, and it advises the Governor-General or the Governor to hold a dissolution and a new election. And when the vice-regal representative is put in the position of having to make the decision of, do I agree to an election, or do I say, do I refuse the advice to dissolve on the basis that somebody else can form a government now and should be able to have the right to govern and continue to govern until, and to serve out the term, do I take that choice? Now, this all goes back, as David would well know, to the controversy about the King Byng affair. It's probably handy they had such lovely rhyming names. But this is a Canadian controversy from, I think it was 1926, about then. Anyway, so what had happened in those circumstances was that you had a person who was king, who was prime minister. He had a minority government, but he had the support of another party. That party got a bit unhappy with the way he was performing. He lost a few votes on the floor. He hadn't quite got to the point of having a no confidence motion against him, but it had been moved. He was going to lose. So he advised dissolution. So he was king. Byng was Lord Byng, who was the Governor-General. And the Governor-General said, well, no, I'm not going to give you a dissolution because I think that, this second party is going to form up with the other party, which, by the way, actually had won a bigger portion of the vote initially. And that between the two of them, they will be able to govern. Now, it was certainly the case that this small party, which had defected from King, had in fact said it was going to join with the other side, and they then would have had a clear majority and been able to govern. So what Lord Byng did at the time seemed reasonably sensible. Unfortunately, as with political deals, it fell apart. And so although the new Prime Minister, Mann, I think his name was, said, you know, took office and said, I'm going to be able to govern, all of a sudden the small party left him in the lurch as well. So he couldn't govern either. So then he advised the Governor-General to have an election, at which point Lord Byng said, yes, I will give you the election. Now, the controversy was that he'd given the second Prime Minister an election that he had refused to the earlier Prime Minister, and that was regarded as inappropriate because he should have given the right to go to an election as Prime Minister, as incumbent, to the first one, because the second one couldn't survive as a government. So from then on, every governor and Governor-General has been somewhat paranoid after the King Byng affair to not make what was known as the big mistake there, which was, you know, appointing someone to be Prime Minister when they didn't really have the support to carry on in government. So the general principle is, when that happens, mid-term in a government, if you, as the Governor or Governor-General, are going to refuse advice for a dissolution, so that's a very serious thing, it's an exercise of a reserve power, you're rejecting ministerial advice. If you're going to take that really serious step, you've got to make sure, or be satisfied, that whoever then you confer the Prime Ministership on is going to have the capacity to continue in a viable government for a reasonable amount of time. Okay? So that's the general principle, and that's what's stuck in everybody's mind. The problem is it doesn't really work in the different circumstance where you're forming government immediately after an election. So the way it works is immediately after an election, if you're trying to form government, you need to, first of all, it's the incumbent. I'm sorry, I'm going to cut across David's questions here. But it's the incumbent who has the right to continue in office until such time as the Parliament meets and to face Parliament on the floor. And if they lose on the floor, then the problem is it's inappropriate, and this is another convention, it's inappropriate to hold an election immediately. Because the people have already spoken, you know, in giving their votes in the election, and to hold another election immediately would be to override the will of the people. Now, it's particularly the case if somebody else can hold the confidence of the lower house. So, you know, some other parties have got together to form what looks like a majority that holds the confidence of the lower house. In those circumstances, of course, the Governor-General or the Governor has no choice but to appoint that person as Prime Minister, because if they don't, they would be overriding both the will of the people in the election and the will of the House as well. Generally not a good thing for a Governor-General or a Governor to do. So in those circumstances, if you spend your time as Governor or Governor-General going out and sort of trying to get guarantees as to whether there's going to be support for the Parliament to run long enough and all the rest of it, you can only really do that if the other option is, if you're not satisfied about stability, is to say, well, we're going to hold another election. But in those circumstances where you've just immediately had an election, that's not really an option. You've got to let the House run until such point as it's shown that it cannot run. Okay? So while if you're making that decision mid-term, where there is a distinct possibility of an election, and you're balancing up between an election and another government, stability is relevant. If you've just had an election, and it's not appropriate to hold another election immediately unless the House cannot function at all, then you've got no other real choice, particularly in our system, because there's not a big enough third party to be able to be auctioning off between the leaders. There really is no other choice. So it's not really appropriate to go and to haul people in and say, well, you know, have you given a guarantee of confidence and all the rest of it. You can see examples of this quite recently in the United Kingdom, because you might remember there with the election, hung Parliament, Gordon Brown continued in office for a period of time until he realised that the Liberal Democrats were not going to support his party in government. Now what's quite interesting there is that Gordon Brown went to the Queen and resigned before David Cameron had actually reached a final agreement with the Liberal Democrats. Now apparently the reason for this was that his spin doctor, Peter Mandelson, had told him it was a bad look to be leaving number 10 Downing Street in the dark. So he had to leave earlier while it was still light. Otherwise, it wouldn't have, well, it wouldn't have looked good for the cameras, and it would have looked like he was sneaking out of government in the darkness. So because of this, Brown left early. The Queen summoned David Cameron. David Cameron didn't know whether he'd formed a coalition yet with the Liberal Democrats, and has reported that when he met the Queen, he told her, yes, he was prepared to form a government. He didn't know what sort of government he would be forming. It could have been a coalition government, or it could be a minority government, and that he would come back and tell her tomorrow if it was a minority government. Now, in those circumstances, the Queen did not say to him, well, you've got to come back to me and give me a document that proves to me that you've got the support of the Liberal Democrats in matters of confidence and supply. She was prepared to make him Prime Minister regardless of whether it was as a minority government without any guarantees of confidence and supply, or as a coalition. And that was because, essentially, there was no other choice. Gordon Brown had resigned. She was not going to be able to appoint the head of the Liberal Democrats as Prime Minister, because he certainly didn't have sufficient support. David Cameron was the only other option, so she didn't ask about stability. And that's a bit of a lesson for here, I think.